Hello, I am Mark Tucker,
And I am Alan Furstenberg, and we are
Two Voice Devs.
Two Voice Devs. Hey, Mark, how's your week
Hey,
been?
it's been a good week. Lots,
Good.
lots going on.
Oh, tell me about lots going on. But one of the really highlights of my week so far has been that we did a takeover of Voice Lunch this week,
Yes, we took over.
and that was really fun. We
Yeah,
had a lot of really good questions of from designers and former developers and a bunch of other people just asking us a whole bunch of questions about what we do with voice.
yeah, and some of it was just like our experience as developers. Over the years. I've worked on bigger teams and smaller teams and startups and in more established companies. I don't know. What about your experience?
I mean, I've worked on teams ranging from groups of military and contractors
Hmm.
to big companies to where I was a team of one.
Yeah,
um
I've been the team of one before too.
so it's a pretty big spectrum there. But yeah, those were some of the more interesting questions that we had, and maybe today let's talk a little bit about the teams that we've worked on and what's worked. And I'll be honest, I've got stories about what hasn't worked. um
Yeah, definitely stories of things that haven't worked. Sometimes you hear it say that, oh, I wear many hats, which is really a way of saying there's different roles on the team that you play. Some of those roles are full-time roles on a team, and sometimes it's I'm um, stepping out of what I would typically do, maybe on the development side, and really focusing on testing. So maybe I'm putting on my testing hat. But I don't know. In your opinion, what are some of those hats that teams have?
that's a good question. And so I think, first of all, and this is one of the questions that actually kind of came up at Voice Lunch, was what's at the top of the structure. And you and I always talk about the developers and the designers. Those are the two roles that we talk the most about.
Mhm.
And we occasionally talk about testing and QA, but we almost never talk about the project manager or the program manager,
Yep.
or the person who is responsible for talking, shepherding everything along, and kind of talking to the client. So when I think of roles, that's probably the role I think of that is, I would say, the second most overlooked role. Probably the first most overlooked role would be the tester,
Yeah.
which is, it shouldn't be as overlooked as it is. But
Yeah. Yikes. Yeah.
so thinking about it, we've got testing and QA, the designer, the developer, and then a program manager.
Right.
And then, ultimately, of course, you also want to be bringing in your operations people, because whatever you're doing is going to have a life beyond creating it. There's the running it part, and that's an important role that again is often kind of overlooked.
Yeah. So this isn't a role that we're going to talk. I don't think we'll end up talking a lot about, because I think we'll spend most of the time on the ones that you've mentioned. But in an agency like where I work, there is stuff that happens before a project happens. There's the, working with people, forming relationships with people in the industry, with people from Amazon, people from Google, from other places, and thinking about overall strategy, or how voice is, where voice is now, where voice is going. So more of the strategy side of things, and and if on an agency, when a project comes in, there's people that have to help figure out what the budget's going to be, what's the staffing. So there's a whole strategy and operations
Partnering.
side of things. Yeah, that's something that doesn't apply in every situation, but it does in a voice agency like where I work.
Yep. And I think also another role that, I don't think we're going to talk much about this time, is in, for a lot of projects or in a lot of cases, you're also going to have a sales or a marketing person
Yep.
who, if you've created a skill or action and, operations now has it out in the world, well, who's marketing it? How do you get people to come into it?
Hmm.
And that's a crucial role, and bringing them in to the whole process before it's kicked out to the world is an important step.
Yep.
But I think all of the, some of these are certainly roles that are important. I'm not sure how much we'd really talk about them though.
Yeah, yeah. You kind of think about, oh, there's a developer and we're creating this voice app, but there's lots of other roles that have to happen, and sometimes you help. Like sometimes I'm on a call with a client and we're talking about technical feasibility about things, and so there's times where I see that front and center, but there's other times where they come back and like, okay, we need X number of devs on this project, and how are we going to do staffing, and who's working on what right now, and that's something that I don't really need to get involved with. There's a lot that happens behind the scenes before it gets to me to say, okay, we're really going to do this. This is
one of the things this suddenly makes me think about is, if you're looking at the credits for a movie,
yes,
modern movies, and they just keep going on and on and on, and you're like, so what are some of these roles? So there's catering.
yeah,
Catering now gets credits in a movie, and the payroll department gets credits in a movie. And on one hand, you're like, really? That but then you think about it and you're like, well, yeah, this whole thing wouldn't run if you didn't have lunch.
yeah. If somebody wasn't getting the funding and paying the bills,
Right.
right?
So, there are all of these other things that go into making a movie, making a skill or action, that's part of the creative process that you don't really always think about as part of that creative process, but it's just as essential in some ways.
Yeah. Yeah. And some of those roles are shared with like if you're working for a client to do something, you're like, we need, what's the artwork that you want on in the store?
Right.
What is the link to the terms of use and privacy policy? Have they been updated for voice?
Legal. I mean, there's a total,
yes.
Right. Legal, definitely another episode or four.
Yeah. And they'll charge by the minute.
Right. No, that's an excellent point. And in some cases, the client has various other requirements, like, it needs to run on their machine, or since it's using their APIs, it needs to be in a container that's run on their premises or permissioned in a particular way. And this is where developers talking to operations, talking to the client, and the PM coordinating all of this is so important.
Yeah, and there's a lot. We have a lot of times weekly meetings with our clients, and giving status of where things are. This is outside of any type of methodology that we're using. Yeah, you can see the Scrum board and the backlog and stuff, but there are still things that happen outside of that you might have to get okays from other teams, or this change requires some functionality and some module that needs to be updated by some completely different team, and so there's coordination that has to happen on that. So there is something that needs to keep the kind of things moving, keeping statuses on everything, keeping everybody abreast on where things are. Yeah, it's definitely just the mechanics of running a project is
absolutely. So what? Let's focus on that role.
Yeah. Okay.
First, and that's the project manager.
Mm-hmm.
Currently in my job, in my day job, I feel like I act as a project manager at least as much as I act as a developer, and that's because I had a great boss who at one point said, I want you to have more exposure to the clients, and I want you to be able to talk to the clients so you understand their requirements, you understand their needs. So, I'll be there, but you're going to be out front.
Yep.
And, that made me the project manager. Now, it was a project manager for a project that usually had one developer on it and one tester and one operations guy, and they were all me. But that was really the first time that I was stepping forward as the liaison to the client. And that's a
Yeah.
big thing because, talking to the client is different than talking to other developers sometimes.
Yeah, and it can be challenging to try to say, okay, I'm down in the weeds talking tech, and I need to then bring it up to a level where, let me just sum up, right? Let me just kind of give you an overview of where things are, but then bring those requirements and be able to, bring them back to the team. So yeah, there is a challenge, but it's definitely, with practice, it becomes easier, and it's definitely a role that's needed.
Yes. And, I think it's important that developers learn how to do that translation.
Yeah.
Because it is kind of a translation in a lot of ways. Being able to say, here's the problem that I have, here's the bug that I found, here's the resource limitation that I have. How do I explain that to the next level up? And how do I explain that to the client? How do I explain that to the PM? Because the PM's not always going to be a technical person or
Yep.
as technical as you, in a way that they can explain it to the client. And that's critical for getting the resources that you need to keep going with the project.
Right. Or, like this is a small problem. I'm working on it. It should be fixed today. This is a blocker. These are the things that we've tried to do. This is what I think we need to do next. And maybe who on, some other team or at the client or something that we need to get this unblocked for us. But, this is a big deal. So, being able to, think through problems, try to think of solutions around how to, get past them, but then also realize, all right, we've done enough of that. We need to communicate clearly and, at a stakeholder level, as opposed to a technical level, what the problem is and what we need.
Yep. No, exactly. And, and these are things that the PM should be helping you with.
Yep.
But the PM's also responsible for things like budgeting time, budgeting money, budgeting other resources. If you are going to need a tester, they should be the ones that are finding the right people to do the testing, the right facilities to do the testing. If you're going to need, if you've got a testing and a testing, a staging, and a production environment, they need to understand that because they're the ones that are coordinating all of these things.
Yeah.
So the PM, we talk about what hats have each of us worn. The PM needs to wear, at least on some level, all of those hats.
Yeah, no, I was going to say exactly. They need to know what's going on. Even if they're not technical, they need to know or be able to translate themselves or be able to ask the follow-up questions so that they can take what they've heard and make sure that they can relay that off. And sometimes that's a conversation with clarifying questions and such.
And I think that's a sign of a really good PM.
Yeah.
Is that even if they don't understand the technical details, they understand enough to ask the right questions and to ask the questions that may lead you towards a solution.
Yep.
I've had PMs ask me, well, why is this so slow? I'm like, well, we've got resource constraints here and here and here. And they're like, well, if we added CPU to the database, will that speed things up? Are you sure you index the database in the right ways? What is the analytics path for that? And when they start asking the right questions, you're like, oh, well, yeah, that's a really good question. Or, I don't know, can we get a database expert in on this? Because we're using database resources that I'm okay with, but can we get an expert?
Yeah.
And that's
can we get 2 hours of Sarah's time to come over here and look at this?
Right. And a good PM knows when to ask those questions and how to ask those questions.
And sometimes it's just needing to be phrased in the way of like, what do you need from me to, or even like, what would be the next thing that you would want to try? Or, sometimes it's just helping you think through, oh,
Right.
okay, yeah.
And also sometimes it's the PM acting as the roadblock. If the customer says, well, I need to talk to your dev, the PM's like, well, my dev is heads down trying to solve your problem right now.
Yeah.
Talk to me, see what I can help you with, and maybe I'll take it to them when they come up for air.
Yeah.
So sometimes they need to be the ones that are, making sure you're getting the work done and doing whatever it takes to let you do that.
Yeah.
So yeah, PMs do an awful lot.
They definitely do.
And it's funny because you talk to a lot of developers and they kind of poo-poo, managers. They're just managing. How hard can that be?
Oh man. Yeah, no,
man.
it can definitely be challenging.
No, it's not easy. One of my first, one of my biggest failures as a manager, and I know we've talked about this on Voice Lunch in the past. One of my biggest failures as a manager was just kind of assuming that the people who were working for me had all the knowledge that I did and could just do it. So I'm, at one point, and this was in the early days of the web, I was managing a project and the person assigned to me did not know anything about the web. And I just kind of said, oh, it's easy. You just do this, this, and this, and here, go look at this documentation. And I kind of dismissed their concerns and their needs. So I think one of the other big roles that managers need to do is make sure you are getting your personnel the training that you need.
Right. And I think that's a responsibility for, it could be all over the project, but like in the example of a developer, so a more junior developer, they might know the technology, but they're new to voice. They might be new to, to the industry, but is to take the time to really mentor them. And sometimes that is like explicitly saying, it's okay that you don't know it all. It's fine. Don't, if you hit a problem, then, spend 30 minutes, spend an hour trying to figure it out, but then come with questions. There's no reason for you to spin on this. Because maybe there's something that I can point you to, or we can talk about it or something. And it's just giving them an opportunity to grow and start from where they're at, and just, take the, patience and a little bit of extra time really to help them.
No, and I think one of the most things that, you can do when mentoring somebody else, if they come to you and say, I'm having this problem, is, okay, let's sit down and take a look at that together.
Mm-hmm.
And, you could look at it and say, well, you know what? That's a tough problem. I don't know. Let's try to figure it out together. Because it's, it shows that you don't have all the answers, but you're teaching them how to figure out how to solve those problems, how to figure things out.
Yeah.
And that's,
so it's like, what have you done already? What do you think the next thing would be? Or like, do you think we should try this next, or this next? And then, just kind of go through and give them a chance to think through it and talk through it, and then try something. And for some reason you think as a developer is like, oh, I know XYZ programming language. I've used, I spent X number of hours. I spent, thousands of hours writing JavaScript or something like that. I should know it all. But every project and every, situation's different. You rarely code the same thing over and over again. If you do, then you try to find a framework that will make that part something that's really easy to do, and then you spend the rest of your time doing
something new, right?
Yeah, then it's the other new things that that's not covered. So
right. So okay, so we talked about the PMs, we talked about developers a little bit, and the importance of bringing up junior developers and our mentoring role as developers.
Mm-hmm.
And we've talked a lot about designers in the past, but I think it's worthwhile to highlight that point is, how much we do need to be able to trust our designers and how much we need to make sure we can work with them and communicate with them.
Yeah, and I think a sign of a healthy team is where people are able to do their strengths, but the team's not afraid to, if somebody's like walks into their territory. So like sometimes the designer creates something and it looks good, and we start to implement it, and then we hit something that's technical, and we're like, what, I could do this. That would take 3 hours to code, or I could do this, which would take me 30 hours to code. And in the end, this, for the user, the difference isn't really going to be that much. Or it's like, okay, clarification, what's more important. And so then you get the product manager in and say, okay, we've got this situation here where what's higher priority, what utterances are the more important, or what use cases or stories that we need to do. So, but then if you see something and you have a suggestion, well, like maybe we should add these other utterances over here. Oh, that's a good idea. So it's kind of a give and take. The teams that I've been on that have been in the end dysfunctional is like, oh, I am doing the architecture role, so I am designing this. Here, developer, here's the design.
The very territorial ones.
Yeah, the developer is like, okay, I code this. Here, tester, test this. And the tester's like, here, user, test, so it's just, yeah. And I have been on teams where it's been very, you do not cross this line because this is not your domain. And that's not a fun way to work, because that's really not a reality. Nobody is just 100% a programmer or just 100% a designer. There's,
Well, no, they're not. And I think part of the reason why not is because we need to understand the constraints that we each have. So one of the things I think we've talked about before, and we certainly talked about it on at Voice Lunch, is making sure that the designer understands some of our constraints, some of how we're doing things.
Yep.
Are we calling one API? Are we calling 10 APIs?
Yeah.
If we're calling 10, now we've got a time constraint. And we may need to talk about, well, okay, we can't fit that in. How can we adjust the conversation to do that better? And sometimes it's, we'll have results and we're like, we have this additional information. Does it make sense to include that as part of the result? And go back to the designers and say, here's what we have that's more than you asked for. Do we put it in? How do we put it in? Is it valuable or not? Being, so that conversation, if I may be so bold,
yes, wow,
is an important one.
Yeah, and it's the situation is this something that's going to be spoken, and this additional information going to be on a display only? When does it make sense if the display is this size versus the display is this other size?
Is the information that we're getting back sanitized in some way? Do we have the phonemes to it, or are we relying on text to speech? And if we're relying on text to speech, what could our problems be there?
Yep.
So lots of things that can come up that really it's a good dialogue between designer and developer.
Yeah, and not only do we need to be concerned about what we know and kind of the constraints that other people are dealing with, and at least understanding where their strengths are, and maybe how you can add your strengths or your experience to their strengths to make something better. But overall, you need to keep in mind what's good for the user, what's the person that's going to use this voice experience. What are they dealing with? What are their concerns? Where are they going to be? Are they going to be at home? Are they going to be in a car? Are they going to be on a jog? Are they going to be, what's important to them? And that could really, be completely different result based on the context of what the user is doing.
No, exactly. I think that's really important. And again, this is where communication with the designer and communication with the PM and communication with the customer really come into play, because the PM and customer should be the ones that understand what's the environment this is being used in.
Yep.
And we shouldn't be developing in a vacuum.
Yeah. So in your experience, like who is the person that is the advocate for the user? And I don't know, what your team size or your experience has been in the past, but I think there's multiple different answers. But I was just kind of wondering what you've experienced or what you've seen.
That's been a really good question. I think back to when I was in the military and some of the projects that I worked on there. In some ways, I served as the advocate because I was also the one that was kind of pushing the boundaries a little bit in developing things. But there was always a PM who was the one who was keeping me in check, who was acting as the reminder of, look, this technology sounds cool, and I know you want to do this, but it's not what they asked for. It's not how they're going to use it. You're trying to get in a feature that doesn't make any sense for the way they want to use it.
Yeah.
And,
so scope creep can happen on the developer side of things, and it can happen on the customer. Like, I know this wasn't what we originally agreed to, but
right. So thinking back to then, that was always the PM who was acting as the client advocate in that case. In other cases, I have, these days in my day job, I do have a keen sense of how a lot of the stuff that I'm using is being used. But I also know that my direct client knows that much better than I do, because they're not the ultimate client. They know who, they're making a service available to somebody else.
Right.
And they know how that somebody else works better than I do. So I rely on them a lot for giving me the feedback when they say, here's what they're going to be doing, or here's what they're seeing and running into on a daily basis. Right. How can we fix that? And I'm like, oh, well, that's a really good question, because that wasn't what we were planning on.
Well, and not to really, highlight one methodology over another, but on Scrum, you have somebody that is the product owner. And so when you've got a question that says, if we have a decision here and how does it affect the client or the customer, right? Then you can go to the product owner, and they'll be able to help you, work through that question or that problem to the user's best satisfaction. But there's a lot that you can do, like the designers that we have here at Rain. They don't just do language model design. They don't just do graphic design. They, some of our projects, we're able to get in and do a strategy session with the client. We're able to do some mock-ups and get with users of the voice-enabled mobile app or whatever it is, and try some things out and get feedback and document that, and how that lead our discussion and direction. And then as we're doing our conversational design, then we've got real user input and some things that we can fall back on to say, these were things that they liked and these were things that they didn't like, and let that inform our decisions.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you something. In Rain, do you have a separate testing and QA group for all of your projects?
What we do a lot of the time is that the testing of the voice experience is usually something that initially we do inside. So we go outside of our team and just say, other people at Rain, go ahead and test this. But then we get people from our client and have them line up a group of people because they're going to be the ones that know their users better. Yep. And so there's the testing that we do during development, like on unit testing. There's I'm pushing it out to the integration environment, and I'm testing it, and the designer's testing it, and the PM's testing it. To now Rain internal is going to be available. Pull some people in from there and test it, and then I'll bring in the client to go ahead and test it, and then we'll get it out to certification or whatever we need to do after that.
Yep. One of the things that's very common, or was very common in the military when I did it, is that we would have a completely separate testing group. Mm-hmm. And what they would do is, it was interesting because they would bring in a completely different set of perspectives. They will have read our design documentation. They will have read the problem specification. They will have read everything that talks about how something should be done. And then they'll come up with their own tests and test the product that we hand over to them. So in some ways, we toss it over a wall because they've had very little exposure to the design and the development process, but they have exposure to the requirements. So they're able to come up with their own testing against the product. And then they're the ones that say, well, you said we were going to do this, and I don't see how to do that here.
Yeah.
And that's when, the designer and the developer go, oh, right, that.
Oh, that's a gap. Whoops.
Right. Or, they will test something and push it outside the parameters that are specified, and they'll say, well, it broke. And we're like, well, you weren't supposed to do that. And they said,
if I do this 10 times and then do this over here, it breaks. And you're like,
will somebody actually do that?
I wouldn't have never have thought of that.
Right.
But, in some cases it might be a totally valid use case, but we just didn't think about it. Yeah.
A good, once again, it's a role that a lot of developers look down upon because they're like, I do unit testing. I make sure
my code. It's great.
My code is good. But it's really good to have somebody that can look at the big picture and say, okay, what can I do that's just a little strange? And
you kind of get this experience over time of like, I wonder if we tested this. It's kind of like you have this little bag of tricks. Like, I'm going to test this over here. Oh, nope. That's you didn't validate this form field, or
so that kind of test team, really, really valuable.
Yep.
Tough to do. It's a tough team to find, and it's a tough job to fill, but it's really valuable. And to be fair, most of my testing is also, I'll test it and hand it off to somebody else that knows the project relatively well, not as well as I do, but relatively well, and then hand it off to the client who, again, knows the project relatively well. And that's a lot of what testing is.
Yep. And you can do different variations. You can have, at the same time that you're writing the code and working through things, you could have testers being, creating the test cases that would test those things. And depending on how your process is, there's usually an environment that you have to pass tests certain, in order for it to go to this one environment, all the unit tests have to pass or to a certain threshold. And, in order to go into this other environment, then these other tests have to work, before you finally get to the point of moving something to production.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked about PMs and customers and designers, developers, and testers. Who else do you think we need to talk about?
Oh my.
Operations.
This is where it's going to get embarrassing, because there's going to be somebody I forget, and
I know.
And it's just like, no, I really do know that your job's important. It's just you're over there doing it, and it doesn't interface with me all that often.
So there are two others that I think are important and really need to be discussed here. The first is operations.
Yeah.
So the folks that are keeping it running on a day-to-day basis. And this is one of those cases where I think, again, a lot of good communication needs to go on between the people who will run it and who are running it, and the PM and the developer.
Yeah.
Because there are things that we can put into development to make their lives troubleshooting things easier.
Yeah, whether that's logging or different frameworks that can check different things, to
tools,
CI/CD,
right? Tools that let them, change configuration parameters,
Yep.
or even in some cases just good coding practice, like not
Yep.
hard coding database targets and passwords, which we've all seen.
Yeah,
but
never done, but I've seen.
No, right. Never done it. But making things so that operations can take them and put them in a container, or make it clear how something needs to, the special settings where something needs to run.
Yep.
How to tune them. If they're seeing performance problems, well, where do we tell them where to look first?
Yeah. Now, how do we scale this up? How do we,
Yeah.
how do we solve for downtime in the cloud?
Oh, because that never happens. Oh.
How many hours did that turn out to be?
So we are talking, I assume, about AWS's US East 1 being down.
Yeah. So like what's in US East 1 except for most of
Everything.
my stuff?
Yeah, no, that was a good 8 hours at least.
It seemed like it, yeah.
Actually, it was more than that all told, I think. So yeah, it was a good chunk of the day. So yeah, what do you do if something's failing? Where do you start to look? where are we logging things? Where have we set up the configuration for you to change where we're logging things?
Yeah.
So yeah, lots of things that as developers, I think we need to be aware of operations and what their needs are.
Yeah. Yeah. Because it's just getting the code written isn't the end. And that's
No.
Just a program running in your staging environment does nothing for your customers or clients, right? This is running from day to day,
right?
24/7, whatever it is, day in,
right.
day out. So
and again, that goes back to thinking about the users.
Yeah.
And I think this is the final role that I tend to think about a lot is the help desk or the equivalent.
Yeah.
Is, this program, whatever we've just done, we assume it's going to have a long life. We'd like it to have a long life and, and several updates. And here's where the help desk or the equivalent, again, needs to be able to talk to the PM and the designers and the developer and say, here's where people are having problems. Here's the features that people need.
Yeah. So here's a feature, it could take a couple months to get. This is a hot fix that we need to get done immediately.
Here's what a lot of users are seeing. Hey, developer, why is this happening? And what can we tell them? Do we have a workaround? Should we tell them to use the workaround, or will that cause more problems down the road? So it's an important role. And again, I think far too often we forget about that role.
Yeah, it's really the whole, from getting the project or beginning, the product to the strategy, the design, the development, the testing, the maintenance, the support. It's just a whole life cycle of what and no matter how many hats that you wear, you typically don't wear all of them. You're usually kind of somewhere in the middle, doing your thing. And it's important to understand the whole thing. I don't know, maybe you've got more experience where your projects are.
Well, I work for a small company. So these days I'm doing an awful lot of those hats.
Oh yeah, no. It's definitely different if it's a small company, a big company, startup, whatever.
And it depends on the projects and the relationship that you have with with either the customer or the direct end user, or it depends a lot on those kinds of relationships and the support that you have within your own company.
Yeah, because your success as a business really is about the relationships that you're able to make and to maintain. And
So any other major roles that you can think of and there are plenty of other roles.
I'm sure there are, and I think we'll get feedback from our users, and we'll decide if there's another topic that we'll cover some other roles in the future. So
as always, you folks can give us feedback either in the YouTube comments, or you can find us on Twitter. And if you've got further questions, or if there's something you'd like us to elaborate, we can certainly take it up on a future episode of Two Voice Devs.
Two Voice Devs. Take care, Alan.
Take care, Mark. Have a good weekend.
Yep, you too.